So, if you are still a free subscriber to this, whatever this is, what is this? It's not a newsletter, and I'm making videos, so I guess it's a video blog or whatever. But if you're still a free subscriber, maybe you want to consider paying monthly. It's only $5, and I could really use the dough. Come right out and say it. Um, so I have been making these videos where I'm reading poems by other people mostly and talking about them a little bit. And I've been thinking of this poem for such a long time over the last, I don't know, this poem always comes back to me. And at times when I guess the world is at its most turbulent in some ways. It's a poem by W.S. Merwin called The Last One. I'm going to read it in a minute, but I just wanted to say a little bit about Merwin and about how I came to Merwin. And I came to Merwin through Adrian Rich, actually. I've written about this, and maybe some of you know this already if you haven't read it. Um, but Adrian was my great mentor in my life as a poet and as a human being. I met her when I was like 15, and we lost touch until I started applying to colleges, and then she wrote me a recommendation for Bennington, which probably got me into the school because I had a terrible test scores. But anyway, so and Adrian was a poet, and I really wanted to be a poet when I was 15 from a very early age. And part of the reason I wanted to be a poet was because my mother worked in publishing. She was a copywriter at Fair Strauss and other places. Then she was assistant publicity director, I guess. And she would bring home these galleys for those in the publishing world and otherwise. A galley is a book before it comes out as a book. It's they're proofs actually, and now they're what they refer to as bound galleys, which means that they kind of look like a book, but on the front it says this isn't a book. It says a reading copy, whatever. I'm explaining all this to because not everybody knows this unless they read a lot or they get galleys. But in the old days, old meaning my mother, um, galleys were not bound. They were distributed in these long sheaves of paper that you would bring home that were rubber banded. Now I don't know. They must not have sent out those things the way they do now because I don't think anybody would read them. But my mother had to read them because she was a copy editor. So anyway, and because of that, she also brought home Publishers Weekly, which is the trade magazine, right? And I used to read it. I would read what they in their forecast column they would have books that were coming out soon. And one of the books was this book called Ariel by a woman named Sylvia Plath. And the description of the book, all it said was poems written in the last months of a woman's life, or something to that effect. And I took the magazine. I ran up to my mother and I said, "You have to get this book as soon as it comes out." And she said, "Why?" And I said, "Because they were the last poems that this person wrote." And I had sort of just begun. I don't know. I don't even know if I had begun reading poetry. Maybe not, because it feels like that was the first book of poetry that I read was Ariel, and didn't know at all what the hell she was talking about, but was so carried away by another form of speech, which poetry is, right? Um, it was extraordinary. It opened up a whole new world where for me, and I read, and then I started to read everything I could get my hands on. I would go to the library once a week and just haul books home of poetry. And I tell people, and it's a joke, but it's really true. One of the things that I loved about poetry was that it was short. Even long poems were short, or books of poems were short. So I could read a lot of them and digest them, which is what I did. Anyway, so in my mentorship with Adrian, my brother, my twin brother, and I, and a wonderful poet named Laurie Robertson, who I'm still in touch with, who lives in France. Lucky Laurie lives in France. Lucky Laurie lives in France. Da, 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 da. We would go to Adrian's house every Saturday, or pretty much every Saturday, and sort of sit at her feet and read poems. We weren't writing poems. I mean, it wasn't like a workshop. It was sort of like a poetry appreciation class, as I remember it. I can't remember giving Adrian poems that young. Over the years, of course, I did, but not that young. And I think I was just starting to write them. But anyway, we talked about Merwin. We talked about James Wright. We talked about, interestingly enough, we didn't talk about a lot of women because she was the only woman poet I knew, that I can remember. Her and Diane Wachowski, and who else did I read then? Diane Wachowski, Denise Levertov. But they're just, there weren't a lot, and that was one of the things that I loved about her. She was really a trailblazer. She was a woman writing poems at a time when a lot of women were not writing poems. So anyway, she turned us on to Merwin. I don't know if she turned me onto this poem per se. I don't think she did, but it's a poem that when I first read it, the first thing I thought of was um, "The Witch of Coos" by Robert Frost. It's a poem that I remember reading that actually terrified me, and this poem that I'm about to read actually terrified me. Not in a bad way, not in a good way. It's one of those poems that does something that a lot of poems don't do, um, which is elicit an emotion, that's obviously unique to the poem itself, but also it's sort of a bridge to all sorts of things. And you'll see because it's very elliptical, the poem. It's kind of vague, but not kind of vague. You'll see what I mean when I read it. And it always feels topical. This is, and which is a terrible word to use for poetry, but there you go. It's called The Last One by W.S. Merwin. Well, they made up their minds to be everywhere because why not? Everywhere was theirs because they thought so. They with two leaves, they whom the birds despise, in the middle of stones, they made up their minds. They started to cut. Well, they cut everything because why not? Everything was theirs because they thought so. It fell into its shadows and they took both away, some to have, some for burning. Well, cutting everything, they came to water. They came to the end of the day. There was one left standing. They would cut it tomorrow. They went away. The night gathered in the last branches. The shadow of the night gathered in the shadow on the water. The night and the shadow put on the same head, and it said, "Now." Well, in the morning, they cut the last one. Like the others, the last one fell into its shadow. It fell into its shadow on the water. They took it away. Its shadow stayed on the water. Well, they shrugged. They started trying to get the shadow away. They cut right to the ground. The shadow stayed whole. They laid boards on it. The shadow came out on top. They shone lights on it. The shadow got blacker and clearer. They exploded the water. The shadow rocked. They built a huge fire on the roots. They sent up black smoke between the shadow and the sun. The new shadow flowed without changing the old one. They shrugged. They went away to get stones. They came back. The shadow was growing. They started setting up stones. It was growing. They looked the other way. It went on growing. They decided they would make a stone out of it. They took stones to the water. They poured them into the shadow. They poured them in. They poured them in. The stones vanished. The shadow was not filled. It went on growing. That was one day. The next day was just the same. It went on growing. They did all the same things. It was just the same. They decided to take its water from under it. They took away water. They took it away. The water went down. The shadow stayed where it was before. It went on growing. It grew onto the land. They started to scrape the shadow with machines. When it touched the machines, it stayed on them. They started to beat the shadow with sticks. When it touched the sticks, it stayed on them. When it touched, they started to beat the shadow with hands. Where it touched the hands, it stayed on them. That was another day. Well, the next day started about the same. It went on growing. They pushed lights into the shadow. Where the shadow got onto them, they went out. They began to stomp on the edge. It got their feet. And when it got their feet, they fell down. It got into their eyes. The eyes went blind. The ones that fell down, it grew over and they vanished. The ones that went blind and walked into, they vanished. The ones that could see and stood still, it swallowed their shadows. Then it swallowed them too, and they vanished. Well, the others ran. The ones that were left went away to live if it would let them. They went as far as they could, the lucky ones with their shadows. It's so chilling. It's such a great poem. I mean, aside from what's going on in there, the syntax. There's very little punctuation in the poem, by the way. There are periods, and there are no commas in the poem. Anyway, I thought I would start off with a Saturday with a cheery little poem from W.S. Merwin. If you don't know W.S. Merwin, um, read him. He's a remarkable poet. I think he's still alive. He lives in Hawaii. If he's still alive, he's very old. The way I've become very old in the last few years. Anyway, bless you all. Keep up the good fight.